I did this online personality test. I just fed in my Twitter account, and based on an article I just read in Scientific American, and it gave me back a personality profile. And one of the things it noticed is that I'm low in agreeableness, so I'm a very independent thinker. I'm willing to hold highly unpopular opinions. So I've been given an assignment by my sponsor. How do I distinguish my will from God's will? And I've got to call a bunch of people in the program, so I just thought I'd elaborate some of my thoughts. So I know what my will feels like, right? Very familiar with running my life according to my will. And so God's will, I got to assume, is a little different from my will. So I don't know exactly what God's will sounds like, feels like, but I do know exactly what my will feels like. So if the internal direction I'm getting is different from my will, then there's a chance it's coming from God. So that's one thing. Other thing is when I pursue my will, particularly because I'm low in agreeableness, it constantly puts me in conflict with other people. So I'm just constantly, having tsuris, having conflict, trouble with other people. So the more I align myself with God's will, then less likely I am to constantly be in conflict with others. So every day I need to take steps 1, 2, and 3. So principle of step 1 is surrender. Principle of step 2 is belief in God, that He has the power to help me overcome my addictions. And step 3 is commitment, to turn my will and my life over to the care of God. So I need to do that every day. So every morning I get on my knees and I say, God, please help me to treat myself and other people with love and compassion. Please help me to know your will for my life today, and please give me the strength to carry that out. Now, that can last an hour or two, but then this starts waning as the day moves along. And so by all these spiritual practices that I pile on in the early morning with prayer and meditation and a 12-step phone meeting and recorded 12-step talks, etc., I get a heightened sense of God in the first few hours of the day, like right now. But then as the day goes along and I'm earning a living, then my sense of God can really start to diminish. But by the late afternoon and evening, my willpower keeps going down as the day goes along, right? You have less and less willpower as the day goes along. You get a minor boost after you eat, but then it starts dropping. So one advantage of this is that as my inhibitions and willpower decline through the afternoon into the evening, then I'm more open to creative insights or God insights that I just couldn't hear other times of the day when my willpower is strong or my inhibitions are strong. So if I'm hearing God's will for me, it's generally going to place me in a smooth relationship with other people as opposed to constant conflict with others, which has been my habitual pattern. And given my personality, like my father's, of being low in agreeableness, following my own will, just like constant butting heads. Like I had this boss and we were just constantly butting heads. And then I've had other bosses where it's a really smooth relationship. So some of that's on me, right? So getting along with other people. And then I'm thinking another test for distinguishing God's will from my will is how would the actions and words prescribed here, how would they look if they were described accurately, reported accurately on the front page of the New York Times? So it's really easy for me to convince myself that my will, I need to do this X, Y, Z. And I'm convinced that this is the righteous thing to do. But if it was reported objectively and fairly on the front page of the New York Times, I'd look like a jerk. I remember when I was profiled on the front page of the Jewish Journal of Los Angeles, and all these people in my religious community are asking, oh, what do you think? And I was in a really bad place, because if I said the profile was fair, then I was saying that I'm a bad guy, because essentially it painted me as a jerk. And if I said the profile wasn't fair, then I was complaining. So I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. So throughout my life, I've done all sorts of things that I think are right and good. But when other people saw these actions and words, they didn't think they were right and good. So when I'm doing God's will, if I do God's will, and that's reported fairly and accurately on the front page of the New York Times, I'm not going to be ashamed. Also, it will look solid all times of the day. So there are a lot of ideas I get at 10 p.m. at night that I would never want to put into effect at 6 a.m. or 8 a.m. Like they're crazy ideas out of left field. So God's will, I'm going to assume, would look good at 6 a.m., 2 a.m., 2 p.m., 7 p.m. Would look good all times of the day. And that it would look good to all the different communities that I'm a part of. For example, I'm an Alexander Technique teacher. I'm part of that community. I'm a YouTube streamer, so it would look good in that community. I'm a writer. It would look good in the journalist and writing community. I'm an Orthodox Jew. It would look good in my Orthodox Jewish community. I have a lot of friends still who are Seventh-day Adventists, and so I would assume it would look solid in front of my Seventh-day Adventist friends. So when I follow my will, often the things that I want to do and say will only make sense to one particular community in my life, and will look really bad in front of other communities in my life. So I used to always lead, these dual lives. I'd code switch. I'd walk out of the house and do my own thing, and then when I got back in my parents' home, I'd behave according to their dictates. But once out of the door, I'd behave according to mine. So I've lived a life of secrecy and hiding. I'd behave completely differently in one aspect of my life compared to another. I'd constantly be trying to hide what was going on in one part of my life from other parts of my life. So I presume that if I'm hearing and doing God's will for me, that it would work throughout my life, in all areas of my life, from Alexander Technique teaching to YouTube live streaming to Orthodox Judaism to writing to my friends from all different parts of the world and all different parts of life and all different religions. So those are some of my thoughts. I'd like to get your thoughts. How do you distinguish your will from God's will? And how do you hear God's will? So I think that's primarily a matter of disposition, orientation. It's not like one particular practice that you can do and then just tap into God's will, but how you're orienting your life towards God, like throughout your life. So it's not that you can cheat in business and then you've got this awesome meditation practice or awesome yoga practice where you hear God's will, or you're just a super spiritual guy except for the hour a day you spend watching pornography, or you're spiritually attuned, God-centered guy except you're constantly yelling at your wife, right? These are not consistent orientation. So I think to hear God's will, we need to predispose ourselves, orient ourselves in a direction towards where we're interested in hearing God's will for us. And if we've got any interfering addictions, be it food or Netflix or sports or debting or underearning or porn, that's going to seriously hamper our ability to relate to God or to higher power, or the transcendence, something bigger than yourself. So how do we hear God's will? Then it also depends on the place that you put yourself. You're going to hear God's will much more clearly in certain places than others. For example, most people will find it more difficult to access God at Dodger Stadium or the LA Coliseum or at a bar or a nightclub or at the Playboy Mansion than if they put themselves at a house of worship or in a serene part of nature, or if they have a room filled with holy objects, holy books. I presume that you'd find it easier to access God in a space of holiness than in a space of where you've got posters, posters from movies, showing people drawing guns and scantily clad women. Okay, the secular space is going to be much harder to access God's will. I find that most people who have no interest in God, they don't create any space in their life where it would become natural to access God. I'm thinking about an ex-girlfriend I had who was a great photographer, and she had all these beautiful photographs and artwork and just a high IQ home, but there was no element of the divine, there was no element of the transcendent. It was just like such an aggressively secular home. I notice when I step into a home, whether it's religious or a secular home, a religious home has a certain feel, whether it's Seventh-day Adventist or Catholic or Jewish, or like a religious home has a certain feel to it. You can sense the transcendence, so you have to place yourself in physical spaces where it's easier to access God. Also, if you have friends who have access to God, it's going to rub off. You're going to get a contact high. You're going to get a contact God high from your friends who have a relationship with God. So the people you put yourself around, the places you put yourself around, and then what you listen to. If you listen to inspiring, transcendent music, you'll have an easier time of reaching out to God. If you spend time in meditation or spiritually centered yoga practice or prayer or Bible study or Talmud study, the equivalent of that, or you have an inspiring clergyman, rabbi, preacher, priest, imam, I think that will help you contact God. So let me know in the comments how you hear God's will, how you distinguish God's will from your will, and how you practice step 3. So step 3 is a decision, a commitment to turn your will and your life over to the care of God. So how do you practice that? So for me, it means I open up 2 hours every morning before I do any work or read the newspaper. I'm spending it in prayer, meditation, 12-step phone meetings, recorded spiritual talks, so that I get oriented towards God. And then I'll check in through the day and renew those first 3 steps. First, step 1, surrender of my will. Okay, doing things my way hasn't really worked out too well. Step 2, belief that God can help me overcome these destructive addictions that have so hampered my life. And step 3, making a commitment to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand Him. So let me know how you work step 3. I'd be curious about that, how you hear God. How does God speak to you? What space do you need to put yourself in to have better access to God? How do you tune your radio into WGOD, radio station KGOD? Like, how do you tune into God's will? How do you distinguish it? Christian, thank you so much for your note. And yeah, my father seemed to be pretty tuned into God. I never saw my father do anything that would cast doubt on his Christian ministry. I never saw my father swear. Like his whole life, I never heard my father say the F word or the S word, or never caught any woman "see you next Tuesday," or I don't think I even heard him say damn. Like if he stubbed his toe, he didn't even swear. Never saw him cheat anyone. Not even the slightest hint of sexual misconduct. Not the slightest hint of financial misconduct in my father's life. So my father set me a righteous example, and I'm grateful for that. Yeah, so following my will has not worked out so well for me. I'm 52 years of age, and my personal failings are pretty well known and well documented. So today I'm going to surrender my will, believe in God, and turn my life over to the care of God. Okay, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Bye-bye.